Bonjour, welcome everyone. Minogigi Jev, it's a beautiful day today. I hope everyone is doing well. My name is Cree Rose Duker, and I'm the program manager for community engagement at Native Governance Center. I am enrolled in the Chippewa Cree tribe, so my peoples are out in Rocky Boy, Montana currently, but I'm living in Casa Grande, and that's where I'm zooming in from today. And Casa Grande is the homelands of the Tohono O'odham and the Peepash peoples. And on behalf of NGC, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today and taking some time out of their schedule. Native Governance Center, if you're not familiar with us, is a Native-led nonprofit really dedicated to supporting Native nations in strengthening their governance systems and their capacity to exercise sovereignty. And to share a little bit more about what we do, we serve Native nations directly with programs like tribal governance support and tribal finance. And we also offer an incredible leadership program for Native changemakers, known as the Native Nation Rebuilders Program. And we provide free resources and events like this for all through community engagement. And we really just encourage everyone to learn more about our programming by visiting our website, which is nativegov.org, or you can follow us on social media to stay up to date at nativegov on most social platforms. And today's virtual event, Better Together Partnerships in Education Across Indian Country, is really going to explore relationships between higher education and the Native students, staff, and communities that they serve. And I think it's pretty common nowadays to see that many college campuses are offering land acknowledgement statements. Some of them maybe offer Native tuition benefits. But when we think about meaningful partnership, it should really go beyond those statements and kind of minimal support. And Native students and staff oftentimes are the ones pushing for and leading change at their institutions. And while Native voices should absolutely be included and uplifted, today we want to identify how we can maybe shift this responsibility in higher education to campus leadership instead. And we're hoping to learn some best practices from a really great panel of speakers today. This is our first event in a mini series that's going to be focused all around the power of partnerships. And so you can look out for our health partnerships session next week on the 24th. And our final session is going to be focused on governance partnerships, and that's going to be on the 31st. Before we start off with our content, we like to address a couple of housekeeping items here in Zoom. First, just want to remind everyone that because this is a webinar format, you'll be able to submit questions for our speakers using the Q&A box here on Zoom. And we plan to transition over to that audience Q&A probably around 12:50 Central Time. And we're also planning on developing and sharing a written resource guide after this event series is complete. So you can look out for that sometime in August. Today's webinar is also being closed captioned. So if desired, you can turn those on by using the button located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Let us know if you need any help with that. And we're planning on starting today's event with just a really short presentation on partnerships basics. And then we're going to follow that up with a panel discussion. And so when we're thinking about partnerships, there is so much potentially that we could talk about. And we know we're not going to be able to get to it all today, but we hope to be able to provide you with some good things to think about, some good key practices, and really get you maybe envisioning how this could work at your institution or within your own role. And so the first thing that we want to start off with is really just the basics. I think many institutions and individuals are afraid of causing harm with their partnership efforts, which is totally understandable. Or maybe they're aware that harm has been caused by their institution and they're not really sure how to move forward from that. And so this leads some folks to just stop because in their fear of doing something wrong, they decide to do nothing at all. And by doing nothing at all, we're actually having this situation where campus leadership unintentionally is putting the responsibility for change on Native students and staff. And so today's speakers are going to share their own experiences and knowledge around partnerships with Native nations and communities. But as an organization, we also wanted to share just a couple of our general best practices when it comes to partnership as well. And these are by no means exhaustive or all-inclusive, but some of our best practices just kind of include doing your own research. So before partnering, actually taking the time to learn more about the Native nations, communities, students, and staff that you're trying to serve. And that could mean pulling together and actually digging into the data that your institution has available so that you're better able to understand who your Native students and staff are. What Native nations do they come from? And then you can also look for opportunities to learn directly from Native nations and leaders. Look at those Native nations near you and try to understand what are some of that nation's biggest priorities, accomplishments, and needs. And maybe how can you meet those in a partnership? And then we also want you to think about getting into a good headspace. So consider if you're in the right headspace to begin partnership work. You might have a wealth of knowledge, but if you don't have the right attitude, you and your work are probably not going to get very far. So we value things like humility, openness, patience, and just having overall an asset-based mentality as being crucial for building strong, sustainable partnerships in Indian country. And understand that while you might be the expert in your field, you're very likely not going to be the expert in that community that you're trying to partner with. So, first, we want you to listen, and then we want you to listen again. And really, in your planning, be open to pivoting, pausing, or abandoning your idea. You'll really need to work at the speed of the community, even if that doesn't necessarily align with your original plan or the speed that you're hoping to move at. Demonstrate your willingness to invest in a longer term process, and that's something that's going to build trust. Relationships really do take time in Indian country, and we also want you to think back to that asset-based mentality and avoid assuming that communities don't already have solutions in mind. If your plan doesn't look to embrace and leverage existing community solutions, you should probably go about refining it. And then we also want you to think about how you can respect and uplift sovereignty in this work. And just to quickly define sovereignty, sovereignty is the natural right of a people to govern themselves. It guarantees Native nations the right to design and control their own future. And currently, it means that Native nations are operating as independent nations within settler occupied lands. And so consider what this means for your institution. Maybe there is an opportunity to partner with a TCU or a tribal college and university. These institutions are really uniquely positioned to support Native students and are often where some of our more rural or reservation-based students start out in their educational experiences. And they're actually facing a lot of challenges right now due to federal funding cuts. And then we also want you to look for opportunities that your institution can consider when it comes to supporting state or local legislature that could support Native nations, or current institutional policy that could maybe change to better support Native nations and students. And this is going to tie back into that first step of doing research. So, how has your institution specifically maybe caused harm? How can you repair that harm and support sovereignty today? And there's actually been some great research done by universities and Native nations and Native orgs around this already, being done about the history of different universities, the harm, but also the opportunity for growth and recommendations on what they can do today. So we really encourage you to check out some different resources, and we'll put them in the chat. But some cool ones to consider are the Truth Project, Land Grab U, Land Grab CT, and many others, but just a few to get you started there. And while we can't really cover it all today, as I shared earlier, we really encourage attendees to learn more about the history of education in the United States and the experiences of Native peoples within these systems. We know these systems weren't necessarily built for us, and that does still have an impact on how families, individuals, and institutions are showing up today. So consider Harvard's beginnings from a native serving institution to the boarding school area and how these past events and experiences really do impact the work that we're doing now. And there is a great report from the American Indian College Fund released in 2024. And thanks to them, we know that Native people are not really finishing or graduating college at the same rate as other students. And unfortunately, Native students have the lowest college enrollment numbers of any cultural group. And while anti-DEI legislation so far appears to have a limited impact on Native college admissions, it is impacting whether or not Native students feel welcome on their college campuses. These are places that are meant to be homes away from homes for students, but anti-DEI legislation can severely undercut initiatives that provide pathways to higher education and programs that help retain and celebrate our Native students who are on campus. For example, we have seen some disruptions so far to cultural center programming, graduation ceremonies, and more. And we do want to be clear that while Native peoples can be included in DEI initiatives, the unique political and legal relationship between Native nations and the United States is separate from DEI. Because of this unique relationship, there is an opportunity to work around hostile legislation that's looking to target DEI and hopefully continue to provide programming and support for Native nations and their students. And from that same 2024 report by the American Indian College Fund, we know that graduation rates for Native students are unfortunately some of the lowest. 27% of Native students graduate from a public community college within 3 years. And for Native students at public four-year colleges, 37% are graduating within 6 years. And there are many reasons for these low rates of enrollment and retention and graduation, and definitely a lot of different work that can be done to improve them. And that's hopefully what we're going to talk a little bit more about today, because many college campuses offer land acknowledgement statements, which can be a great starting point for campus communities to learn more about the land they occupy and Native nations connected to it. But there's so much more that can be done. So going beyond land acknowledgement, we're seeing some college campuses, or in some case states, pass policy to provide Native tuition benefits. We're also witnessing institutions provide more visibility, education, and connection through incorporating Native languages, art, and design on campus. And then more and more institutions are also realizing that for true partnership and collaboration, they have to take the time to do that trust and relationship building and do that with Native nations, communities, and individuals. We have a great guide online called Going Beyond Land Acknowledgement that can kind of help you start to think about or plan how you can show tangible support to Native nations and Native peoples. And collaboration really also requires a strong commitment to reciprocity and to sovereignty. There are a lot of successful partnerships between university systems and Native nations that are providing critical support for tribal health, natural resources, education, and more. And we want to give a shout out to a couple of those. There's the University of Washington and their Center for Indigenous Health, the University of Oklahoma's American Indian and Indigenous Law Program, and the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona, and many more. But these are all great models for research, policy, and advocacy collaborations. And now I think you've heard just enough from me. It's really my great honor to kind of briefly introduce today's incredible speakers before handing it over to them. We have really three incredible Native women joining us today, all from different educational experiences and areas. And I don't want to share too much about them because they'll have a chance to introduce themselves. But I'm just so excited to hear from these Native women leaders. And Dr. Minthorn is going to be our moderator today, and we'll kind of kick off today's conversation. But Raman, welcome. And if you want to go ahead and get that started for us, miigwech.
Sure. Thank you, Kuri. So Thank you all for being here on this wonderful Thursday morning or afternoon, depending on where you're at. Really appreciate that. Also grateful to have Kiara and Athena here with us as well today. So hopefully we can just have a conversation and really just honor your hard work. And I may share a little bit about some of the things that I've been able to also participate in. And then also know that we'll be having some questions later on as well. So really looking forward to getting to know you all. So in that way, if you don't mind telling us a little bit about who you are and your personal experience with partnerships between Native nations or communities and higher education institutions. So whatever you feel like you would like to share to be able to provide context and background about who you are. I look forward to hearing about you. And Kiara, if you want to go first, that's okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hello everyone. My name is Kiara Tantaquidgeon. I'm also called Kiskwahotow or Sunrise by my people, which are the Mohegan people of what is now known as Connecticut. I was born and raised in close connection to my Mohegan kin and culture on the border of Norwich and Uncasville, CT in the Connecticut River Valley, and I'm super honored to be here with you all today. I'm currently a researcher working on community-based projects with Indigenous folks at Harvard University, as well as the Johns Hopkins Center for Indigenous Health. And I am also the founder, president, and CEO of the Sunrise Healing Community, Inc., which is a nonprofit organization with a mission to empower Indigenous youth to foster healing through cultural connectedness, as well as revitalization. And so I'm incredibly passionate about health equity and environmental justice, as well as Indigenous representation in education, which is what brings me here today. In 2019, I established the Indigenous Student Union, or ISU, at Quinnipiac University, which was the college's first organization for Indigenous students and allies. Despite the fact that if you hear Quinnipiac University in the name, you might think, doesn't that university have an Indigenous name? Doesn't it also occupy Indigenous land? The answer to those questions are both yes, but it didn't have an organization or a space for Indigenous students at the time. But it does now, and now I serve on the organization's alumni council, and in this role, I have had the opportunity to coordinate and lead planning for the Dancing in the Shadow of Sleeping Giant powwow, which was the first contemporary intertribal powwow that was on university grounds, and I think in the town of Hamden, to my knowledge, which is really cool. And so throughout my experience as president and now as alumni advisor and powwow coordinator of the Indigenous Student Union, I have been in a unique position of being kind of at the intersection of the partnerships between Native communities and higher educational institutions, and very much have experienced it from the student and alumni side. And while I have seen the value in these collaborations over time, I have also definitely experienced the challenges. And I know we'll get into that more throughout this panel, but just at a glimpse, I think more often than not, there's quite a bit of institutional resistance, which can make these partnerships really difficult to maintain when, especially you're a student who's trying to really work to maintain them. The burnout and other barriers to success that you can experience are very, very real, especially when Native students and community members are pushing for recognition and inclusion in the face of persistent resistance. And so these experiences have shown me how important it is to continue working toward stronger and more supportive partnerships with Native nations, but it's also shown me that there's a lot of work to be done. Um, and so I'm really excited to be here with you all today to kind of provide my insights onto how we can foster more meaningful relationships in this context. And I want to say kutaptom tamawash. I thank you all so much for having me. And I'll pass it over to Athena.
Shiva Shinila, thank you, Kiara. That's super powerful. Wow. Chela Athena Relato Swa Umnushi. Hello, good morning, or good afternoon, depending where you are. I'm Athena Relatos, enrolled in the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians in Oregon. And I'm located in Portland, Oregon. And I think my journey is unique, and coming from my own experience. I just graduated with a Master's of Architecture from Portland State University a year ago. And so my kind of experience has just been as a student going through the educational system that I definitely did not think I was ever going to be a part of growing up. I grew up in Portland, and then I also grew up on my reservation, which is in Siletz, Oregon. And so I definitely didn't think I would be making it to a university in my life. And so to, come to this other end of having a master's now and working professionally has been a really long journey and a really challenging one. And while I was in the university, I left for a year. It's incredibly hard to continue to stay. But what kept me a part of my program was the incredible community of Native people that are on our campus. We have a really wonderful Native American Student and Community Center on our campus, but it goes through its own struggles, not being funded by the institution. It has to fund itself. And so there's a lot of hurdles and barriers. And like Cree mentioned, having a home away from home is incredibly important. And so I think basically I was a student trying to make it through a system that wasn't really meant for me. And I kind of leaned into community as I'm used to. And I was really, really, really fortunate to have incredible mentors guiding me along the way and other folks that just sort of kept, were my strength through the program. And then I just continued to do that for other students, especially in architecture. It's a very challenging program to get through, very Western in ideology. And so for a lot of Indigenous students, it's a jarring experience. And so now, having gone through it, I've just continued to be that person for other Native students that are going through it, just showing up for them in any way that I can, just because we know it is hard to, become a part of the percentage that makes it. And so, yeah, super excited to kind of share a little more about that experience. And again, Shua Shinila, thank you.
Thank you both so much for sharing. Really appreciate hearing more about you and your background. I'll try to briefly share. Honde Onde Papa Onde and Robin Ziptahola Menthor name Ka. My name is Robin Ziptahola Menthor. I'm a citizen of the Kiowa tribe. I'm also a descendant of the Apache, Nez Perce, Umatilla, and Assiniboine nations. And I'm currently, I'm currently a professor and department chair of educational leadership and policy studies at the University of Oklahoma, which is located on the ancestral lands of the Wichita and affiliated tribes and the Caddo tribes. But today I'm actually joining you from the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, which is comprised of the Cayuse, Walla Walla, and Umatilla people, hence the flag behind me. I'm actually recording this from the Temuslik Cultural Institute, which is the tribal museum here on the reservation. And I'm really grateful to be here today. I have been a higher education student affairs practitioner as well as a faculty member for over 20 years. And so my student affairs background and partnerships was in Oklahoma, where I was able to, I worked at the Tribal College, Comanche Nation College when it was in existence. And then when I was at Oklahoma State University, I also worked closely with the Pawnee Nation College, which is a tribal college 20 minutes away from Stillwater, Oklahoma, where I was able to teach with them for 2 years. And I think, and I know we'll talk more about this, I think for me, it's always about the relationship building with local tribal communities. That's essential. And so when I was at the University of New Mexico, I also worked to establish an Indigenous doctoral cohort program. And that wasn't done just like by my own knowledge or expertise. It was really with the incorporation of feedback from the tribal communities in New Mexico. And that was how it was created and built, and really established that to be able to make it tribally connected. Because though I am Native, I'm a guest and a visitor to New Mexico at that time. And so I just wanted to make sure I was responsive to their needs and what their strengths are that they currently already have, which I appreciated. Cree sharing is like our tribal communities have strengths, they have knowledge, they have wisdom, and it's up to us to also bring that in as well. And so then at the University of Washington, Tacoma, I also worked with the Muckleshoot tribe there. And we also have established a partnership with our School of Education and had memorandums of agreement with our Indigenous doctoral program, our tribally based doctoral program, and then a master's program. So we had signed, or at that time, we had signed 3 MOAs with the Muckleshoot tribe. But we had Native doctoral students participating from across Washington and also different parts of the United States. And then now I'm currently back home at the University of Oklahoma, where I did my undergraduate and master's degrees. And this last year, I started serving officially in the role of coordinator of tribal indigenous education initiatives. And so this last year, we were also able to establish a tribal indigenous education advisory board, which is the first time that we've been able to have that within our College of Education. And that is represented by tribal communities from our area, as well as Indian Ed programs and tribal colleges in Oklahoma, just to make sure that our College of Ed is responsive to tribal communities and also that they are co-creating what we need within our College of Education. So I'll just leave that there. But that's kind of some of my experiences in regard to tribal partnerships and connections. I'm grateful for all of your hard work and your connections. I'll go ahead and go to the next question if that's okay. Is when it comes to recruitment and retention of Native students, what are some ways higher education institutions can meaningfully connect to build relationships with them and their communities? So how can higher ed build relationships with the local tribal communities to help with recruitment and retention of Native students? And either of you can go whenever who feels called to go first.
I can go first. So I think, from my own experience, like I said, I didn't think I would make it to a university. I didn't think I would even especially get a master's degree. So even retention for me was incredibly hard. I left for a year, and during that year, I fully worked with my community and doing ITech work, Indigenous, traditional, ecological, and cultural knowledge, because I was so burnt out, from the institution. And so I wasn't sure I was going to come back to my program at that time. And then after that year of rest and retrieve from my community, I was able to come back and make it through. And so I think from that experience, I just know how challenging it can be. And the thing that has always gotten me through is to have relationships within the university of other Indigenous people and allies as well, that kind of become your anchor point and your kind of like, cheerleader in a sense, and just making sure that they're showing up and strengthening, any kind of opportunities that there can be. And so I had a really, really wonderful mentor named Judy Bluehorse Skelton that is all things wonderful. And she's Nez Perce. And so she's kind of been working within Indian education. She used to work with my auntie on Indian education 20 years ago. And fortunately for me, my tribe, we have our education department. And so my education specialist from my tribe initially had me connect with her before I even went to the university. And so I was really lucky to kind of just start a relationship by going and meeting with Judy, even before I stepped foot on the campus. And so that kind of became someone that has looked out for me throughout my whole journey in school. And so that's sort of becoming my own role as I'm now on the other end. And so I think the thing though that is important is for folks that aren't enrolled and don't have that education specialist making those relationships, it's just important that those places on campus or universities are visible. And so for Portland State University, we have a Native American Student Community Center. It's struggling currently because funding is incredibly challenging. And as I mentioned, they have to fund themselves. And so that is really hard, and it does fall on Native students to kind of continue to figure out how to make funding work. And when it doesn't, it's hard, and then the door is shut, and that's the barrier that becomes, the people don't know where to go then, and just having, your visible community that you can feel comfortable around. And so right now, and while I was in school, even before I started my master's, me and Judy and others in our community made an Indigenous, traditional, ecological, and cultural knowledge program at the institution. And we are also currently building an iTech center on campus. I'm a part of that design. So in the professional world, I've helped now we're designing that building and designing the landscape. We're just restoring it to a traditional oak savanna. So it's becoming a center to kind of is a placemaking center, but also a teaching center to show others in the community what an oak savanna is, what are our first foods, what are our medicines, what are our culture. We added the C in iTech. A lot of folks might just know tech or iTech as ITEK. But we felt it was really, really important and that we couldn't leave out the cultural part. You can't just take our knowledge and not understand where it's coming from a cultural lens. And that cultural part is everything, you know, in that. So we've been putting on traditional salmon bakes. We've been just making space for people on campus just to see us. So we're just out there in the center of campus at the Oak Savannah often, and we're having a salmon bake and everybody's welcome. And that's sort of brought in a lot of other community members from the school itself that they just smell the salmon, they see the eagle flying above because the eagle's ready, you know, in the middle of a downtown city. And people get interested. So and when my auntie said, when I was growing up, you build the fire and people will come. And that's sort of something that we've believed in. We've just built the fire on campus and people, you know, come and they get really interested. And so, and also while I was in school, I basically bridged the Indigenous Nation Studies department with the architecture department since I was in the School of Architecture. And now we've kind of been able to break the walls of programs being siloed and not communicating. And now we're building the center. Our departments have done a lot of cross education. So also while I was in my master's, I taught an Indigenous architecture class, and it was open to all majors, not only architecture students, but students from other, you know, Indigenous Nation studies, or we had people in the sociology department. So I think a big part of perhaps kind of breaking that barrier and being able to actually build meaningful relationships is kind of pushing back on institutions to rewrite what the codes are for class requirements and not having certain majors be so siloed into what you're supposed to be taking, because I do feel like it is important for a lot of folks to have experience or just sort of an opportunity to be learning from each other. So we have now a lot of classes that people can take from all sorts of majors. And that just gets conversation started. And that's where really the magic happens, because we now can have the biology department working with us in our first foods and our medicines. And it's become a really a wonderful thing, but it's incredibly challenging because it does take buy-in from the university. And oftentimes that takes a lot of work. And it just takes a lot of willing people that are okay with kind of spending their time, extra time out, you know, not getting paid to make these things happen. And so I think that in order to keep Native students a part of these programs is making sure that one, the kind of education is available, like iTech for one, having mentors available and having the barriers lifted between whatever program a Native student wants to be taking, to be able to maybe incorporate things that are, you know, Indigenous education. That's what kept me for sure in my program. As I was in my Master's of Architecture, I could still be taking classes within Indigenous Nation Studies, which meant that I could still be around my community, because when things get really hard, when you're swallowed up by, you know, for me in architecture, all things kind of Western colonial and ideology, it is an honest nightmare. And so being able to kind of have your elders around you, other, you know, people like you, and take the classes that are just being around community, honestly, was my medicine throughout school. And yeah, I'll leave it there. And I don't know, Kiara, do you have something to add?
Yeah, thank you so much, Athena, for sharing that. I think on the note of what you said, I remember I was in a brainstorming session for an Indigenous educational initiative a few years ago, and one of the participants shared that dropping their child off at college was like the worst day of their life, and really reflected on how much fear they had about letting their child go into this space that, like you said, wasn't really made for them. And not knowing if they would be happy, supported, or even safe in that environment. So yeah, so like I just think in general, when we think about the impact that building these relationships could have, it's not only on the students or on the communities, it's also on their parents and their guardians, and the whole community that is really leaning on the strength of, this person. But in general, too, I think that there are other strategies that come to mind in my specific experience because, like I said, I went to a university where when I got there, there was nothing, that we didn't have a cultural center or even like a student group. And so based on like looking at the website and stuff for Quinnipiac when I was applying, I knew it wasn't going to be the place for me. It was not my top choice by any means. It wasn't really even a choice. It was kind of a backup option because they gave me a free application waiver. Um, and right before it came time to pick where I needed to go to college when I was a senior in high school, I was going through a lot with my family, and it just made the most sense to be close to home. And it was the only school I had applied to in Connecticut. So I was like, oh, here we go. Like, guess I'm gonna have to do this. And I very much went into it with the idea of I'm gonna stay here for 1 year, get my family back up on their feet, be close enough that I can go home every weekend, and then I'm out. I gotta find somewhere that like has this community I'm looking for. But when I was, at programs like the Dartmouth-bound Native American Community Program as a high schooler, or just at other things, getting the chance to meet people through the Center for Native American Youth and things like that, I very quickly realized that it wasn't my experience was not isolated to just me, and it didn't really even matter across the board. I was talking to people at universities like Yale who have these, huge endowments, huge cultural centers, and they were still experiencing a lot of the same struggles that we were experiencing. Um, and so I think one of the most primary strategies that comes to mind for me for this is to support those student organizations and cultural center spaces. Um, and while it is important to do that financially, and I think that that is honestly the most important thing, like everyone needs more money, we all know this. Um, but I think that there are a lot of other barriers that make it really hard for Indigenous student groups to be successful, especially small ones. And so the Indigenous Student Union at Quinnipiac has only consistently ever had 4 to 5 Indigenous identifying students a part of it. The rest of the group has always been allies, which is great to have that community, but we just don't have a lot of Native students on campus. Um, and so the students who are doing the work of setting up the events, planning the powwow, things like that, they are doing it completely on their own, and they're often juggling full-time course loads, even jobs, trying to navigate, booking spaces on campus and getting their speakers reimbursed. And all of this is very complicated processes as well. The university, and I'm allowed to say this now that I'm graduated, it seems like it has intentionally made it really challenging to do things like this. Like you have to submit like 5 different types of paperwork to get someone paid, and then the check comes like 2 months later, and it makes it so that the person doesn't want to work with us anymore. Um, and so there's issues like that that definitely persist, that I think if there was a way to streamline those processes and just understand that students across the board in all multicultural groups, in any affinity group, never mind Indigenous student groups, are spread too thin and do not have the time to be kind of operating what acts like a full-time job in the background of their life. So having that support financially, but also in like a systematic way, like having more faculty or just people who aren't students who can be within the organization helping out, I think would be instrumental. And then one other thing I wanted to add too is that going off of what Cree said, like it is important, I think, to start with doing your research, like really needing to identify what Native nations you should be talking to. Because in the case of Quinnipiac, what we often heard when we would talk to people about relationship building is they thought that the Quinnipiac didn't exist anymore. They thought that, their tribe had been lost due to the legacy of colonization, and then that they didn't have a responsibility to Indigenous representation because of that. And so there was a big element of education that had to come from the side of me as a student, someone who's still learning. I was an 18, 19, 20-year-old girl trying to educate these faculty members and administrators of a university about the fact that we still had a responsibility to the Quinnipiac, whether or not they believed they were still here, and that we had a responsibility to the other Indigenous peoples of what is now known as Connecticut, but what we know as Connecticut. And we had to have really challenging conversations too. So I think doing their research, as much as it seems like such a simple thing, and it's so annoying sometimes to have an advocate or an activist say, just do your research, but it really does sometimes boil down to that. And there is so much now that because we have, I think, this resurgence of Indigenous representation in media, in education, and we're seeing so much more of it, it becomes now that there's less of an excuse to not do that research. And it really gets to the point now where I think the universities and the institutions need to take that responsibility to really educate themselves. And we, as advocates, don't need to beat around the bush anymore of feeling like that's not a nice thing to tell people. Like, I think it's okay for us to be like, no, you need to open a book, and then we can really have a good conversation about how we go from here in like a mutually beneficial way. So yeah, that is a little bit of a rant, but where I'm going.
No, thank you. Thank you both. It really is beautiful to hear your experiences. So thank you for sharing. And also like that all speaks to like many of our Native students' experiences in varying ways, whether they have presence on campus or they are the ones creating that presence, right? And so really appreciate you sharing that. And I think I would just add just a small amount, a few things, which is that sense of responsibility that I feel you all are talking about, like from the institution's perspective, like they need to have that sense of responsibility, because if they don't have that sense of responsibility, then they won't be committed to the funding. They won't be committed to hearing and understanding like how they build relationships, whether or not they see those tribal nations as being current or ancestral connections, right? And so like how we think about that. And so just a few recommendations that for institutions who may be thinking like, what are our next steps, especially in these times of where we're at today is, how do I fund or support a tribal liaison within my institution who can help cultivate these relationships, but also sustain them, but also acknowledge that it's not just a tribal liaison's job, it's everybody's job. It's all of the administration's job to build these relationships. And I think the other part of that is the presence in the Native community, right? So like we can expect for our students to feel comfortable, like you said, the parents feel comfortable to drop off their child if they've never seen anybody from the university come into their community and be a participant, to be able to be there in the varying tribal events that are they're welcome to, of course, right? And so just thinking about like what is appropriate to be present in, but to be present and to be there to understand the different ceremonies and timelines of our children and their youth that are coming into colleges and universities. How do we acknowledge like those times, like how many days do they need to be out for a funeral, how many days they need to be out for different ceremonies, and acknowledging that and incorporating that. So I think there's a lot, and I know y'all will share more, so I'm excited to hear. So we'll go ahead and go on to the next question, which is Native students and staff, which you all kind of already started talking about, are often the ones tasked with leading change and partnerships with their institutions. While we want to honor the work these leaders have done and continue to do, we welcome any advice you have to give them. What should this process look like ideally for Native students and staff, and even for non-Native, staff and administrators? So wherever you would like to answer this question from, you're welcome to. Thank you.
I can start. I'll keep it brief for this one because I know that we're getting close to Q&A time, but I also just wanted to share like a quick example of an instance where I do think that it could have been more ideal, because I think I really like this question that in that it honors the important work that Native Indigenous students and staff have done, because I like there's so much of it and it is so great and it is something to be celebrated, but at the same time it is a process that's far from ideal. And while we do want to celebrate the work they do, I think there's instances, especially in my experience, where there's I've pushed myself in a way that should not be celebrated. Um, and so for me, if the process was a lot more collaborative, like we've said, I think it would have been a lot easier on my mental health, on my grades. The semester that I started the Indigenous Student Union at Quinnipiac, I got like a 2.8 GPA, which wasn't terrible, but in the realm of like the path I had set myself on in terms of GPAs at that point, it was very much an outlier um on the plot. And so because there was no native, we didn't have any native faculty to my knowledge at the time. We had very few native students, and it was a lot on me to like be doing outreach to things like the Akamat Educational Initiative to get some assistance. And so just like a basic example of how that could have been easier is like if the university had someone who could have reached out to Akamat for me and helped me set up that meeting, instead of having to do that myself. Like just one little thing that I think could have been a lot of support throughout that time because like I said, it was like doing a full-time job on top of having an actual job and doing school and all of the other things in my life.
Yeah, I feel like truly I've really seen Native students and Native staff be the spearheads of a lot of this work. The whole time I was a student, I was also juggling a job. I was also juggling making sure that other Native students were feeling heard and if there was harms being done within their programs that they were being addressed. Um, it's exhausting and it's incredibly wrong to be having, all of that work fall on Native students and, and staff also. I think it really takes folks doing the heavy work that it like Kiara mentioned, like doing the research on their own, not, like sure we can offer up some pointers on where to start, certain books to read or whatever it is, but I think it is a real we are constantly being asked from the communities everywhere around us to do one thing or another. As soon as people recognize you as and see you constantly in the community as a Native leader, you get asked and pulled in many directions constantly, and especially even as a student, even when I was a student, I had a lot of different organizations, different architecture firms reaching out to me. I did a whole decolonize architecture workshop for a firm as I was a student. And while I was overjoyed with the fact that this firm, wanted that for their firm and they wanted to be doing that work to try to understand what decolonizing architecture meant. It was also like, I was a student trying to get through architecture myself, and that's already a heavy lift, huge heavy lift on its own. And so I think there's a little bit of a maybe disconnect sometimes when folks will recognize the work that you're doing and they're hungry for that information and they're excited about it. While also, like I can be a bit of a like, I want to see the change happen. And if I'm not going to do it, if they're asking me like, who else is going to do it mentality, but that's also like, I need to be taking care of myself and like keeping, my mind, body, and spirit in a good way to be able to walk in a good way, to be able to like get through the education on its own. And even now on the other end as a professional, it's this, same thing. Like I have my job that I'm doing, and then I'm also still making sure that these needs are being met. And so I really feel like it just takes the allies to do the research and to step in just to help out. We've had incredible folks in my community, incredible allies that have been doing that work. Like they've done, we have a really wonderful person that took a whole degree to learn like library work so that they can help build our decolonized library on campus, or our Indigenous library, we're going to call it instead. And they're a white ally, and they were, they just saw the need, and they've been a part of our community. Like I mentioned, we put on the salmon bakes, and we just make the presence of us known on campus. And we invite everybody to come and just to start building those relationships, because I think there is that reluctance when people don't want to, you know, come up and do something wrong and cause a harm. But I feel like that, you know, part of it is just understanding that perfectionism needs to kind of dissolve a little bit. You got to soften that a little bit. Be willing to make mistakes. I make a ton of them, you know, like we're always gonna make a little bit of a mistake, and that's okay. It's about showing up and being willing to listen and sort of like just try to learn and understand, and then do what you can. If you make a mistake, that's okay. You learn from it, and hopefully you don't make it again. Then you know, then it's no longer a mistake if you keep doing it. But so yeah, I think that's sort of is just for folks that are, you know, for non-Indigenous folks to just really be willing and eager to learn and to build relationship, and then sort of see where someone may be pulling a lot of weight as an Indigenous person, and see how you can help just a bit, because all things are done in community, you know, things are not done in isolation. And I think that there is a very pervasive mindset of like individualism that says you have to do it all by yourself. I have to do it all by myself. And I find myself with that same mentality sometimes. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, like I have not done anything by myself. I've had my community lifting me up this whole time. I've had, you know, just all the relationships praying for me on that I didn't even know. After I graduated, I was told like the whole community's been praying for you this whole time. And I was like, those prayers worked. I didn't think I was gonna make it, you know? So yeah, I think that's sort of what I would say about that. And also I wanted to mention for the last one, for recruitment and, you know, retention, institutions need to do some real heavy work on their curriculum, because a lot of it is super, super harmful. And that is like the most basic thing. Even for me going through architecture, doing, you know, history for one, history of architecture, all European Western centric. And I'm like, you're in on my, you know, in Oregon, in my own homelands currently. And I'm like, you know, you're on my homelands, you're not talking about Indigenous architecture whatsoever. And then when they wanted to talk about it, they looked to me and wanted me to teach about it. And I'm like, hey, I'm paying you. You should have done this, you know, you should have done this research on your own to be able to help educate and build upon my knowledge too, you know? So I think that's a really big one, because when it comes to staying in educational centers like that, we have to be learning the real history, and also that literature or whatever the curriculum is cannot be anti-Indigenous, and it is currently, you know? So that once that's a part of your experience going through school, it's really hard to stay in that. So anyway, I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you both. And I just want to acknowledge both you, Kiara and Athena, for your time and your effort as a Native student leader. You know, as you spoke to, it's a lot of hard work, a lot of time on top of all of your other commitments as a student, as, you know, you know, whether you're working or employed, as a community member. And I was a former previous long time ago student leader. And I think with my own experience as a student leader and supporting Native student leaders, you know, I think for me, that's how I started to build this Indigenizing Pedagogy Institute at University of Washington, Tacoma, and then now it's at the University of Oklahoma, where it works with non-Native faculty to help them figure out, one, and acknowledge their identity and how that impacts their teaching and pedagogy. And the other is it helps them understand like who the local tribal communities are, to be in relationship with those local tribal communities. And then the other is like, how do they indigenize their curriculum, their syllabus, their programs, their space in their classroom? Because one of the things is like, it's not just for Native students, it is for Native students, and that's the main purpose, but it's not just for Native students, because all of our students benefit whenever we indigenize our curriculum and our spaces, because many people don't have that cultural identity or connection. And so I was able to work with non-Native faculty at the University of Washington, Tacoma, and then now at the University of Oklahoma. And it's really just an opportunity for them, one, to learn and to engage, but then that also has rippled out into like how they did research, how they bring in Native students into their own, what they're doing. And then it also just helps them to then share that with their colleagues and their friends and their departments. So it creates a sense of responsibility. And I think to me, we have to work in multiple ways, right, to be able to make spaces safe for our Native students and make where they feel welcome. And so I just appreciate all that you all have shared and that you have done. So we'll go to the last question because I know there's a lot of Q&A. So we all have said some wonderful things to be able to trigger some good questions or help people think of some good questions. So if there is one small or large change campuses could make today to be better partners to Native nations, staff, and students, what would you say that is?
I can chime in. I did a lot of thinking about this, and I landed on I don't know if there is one change. I think the issue that I've seen in my experience is that we often approach the challenges that we face on campuses with isolated solutions. And then we kind of are like, okay, we ticked off one box. Now this native student will leave us alone and she'll get off our back for a little bit. Um, so and I think the common example of this is the land acknowledgement. They write a land acknowledgement, have it somewhere publicly available on their website, and then they're like, that's it, that's enough. Kind of washing their hands of anything, at least until the next angry native student comes along and has another demand to meet. And so in my experience, that was the legend of the Bobcat at Quinnipiac University. It was like this school spirit legend that was a complete appropriation of the Quinnipiac and indigenous stories of Hobbamock the giant. And it was like they threw in a bobcat, said the bobcat like tamed the evil spirit and whatever. Most of our stories about Hobbamock is that he's a kind spirit. But so we kind of, rallied together to demand its removal, which seemed like a very simple thing to do. It was really hard and faced a lot of resistance. The university saying that it was the backbone of their school spirit and they would have no school spirit without it. And I was like, well, that's problematic also. Um, but when it was removed, it was done in complete silence. We didn't even get like a notification that it was going to be removed. It was just no longer on the website, and there was a big plaque in our student center and it was taken down. And so once the legend was removed and we noticed that, we were like, oh, great, that's a step in the right direction. Like maybe we can present these new demands we have. Like the Indigenous Student Union wasn't funded at the time. We were like, can you help us streamline this? And they were like, well, we already removed the legend. We can't do everything. Like we did it. Like you should be happy now. Go away. And so I think that kind of highlights the bigger problem is that when we address issues one at a time or with one singular solution at a time, um, it gets kind of lost in the sauce, for lack of better words. So I think it requires like a sustained and multifaceted engagement and action, like we've been talking about. It requires a university-wide commitment to doing all of the things that need to be done, starting with curriculum, like Athena said, and going down the list of those differences. Because like it's not one change that is going to, I think, make the situation better. That and all of the challenges that we've talked about today come from different sources. They might come from the same foundation of colonial ideology in the institution, but it's so entrenched into all of like the subsystems of the wider system that it's going to take a lot, I think, of digging to really excavate that.
Uh, I will say, like the saying, show me your checkbook and I'll show you your values. I'm going to say the biggest change is money. I think campuses should be funding programs for Indigenous students and staff on their own. I think they need to be investing in those connections financially. I think that, that is the biggest thing that, being able to pay our community members for their input, for their work, for all of the leading and organizing that we're doing to make their campus a better place. And it really comes back to funding, like that's sort of one of the biggest hurdles is just being able to be funded and being able to make ends meet. And, even for Native students, there's been a lot of good funding over here in Oregon for Native students to, have, tuition paid, but you have to be an enrolled student, enrolled Native in order for that to happen. And so I think there's just a lot that universities can do to make it more accessible for Native students financially. And a big one is just, you know, truly as any kind of institution that want to say that they care about Native communities and Native relationships, they need to be paying for that. They need to be doing that reparation of their teaching and making a ton of money as an institution on our homelands, and they're still asking us to then fix it and pay ourselves with our time and our efforts and also financially. And so that's the biggest thing I think is, you know, for folks that have the money to be helping out, if they see you know, care about any kind of Native-led organization, to just be putting their money into that. And that's, you know, shows your real values, truly. I think that's.
Thank you. Thank you both. That's really a good starting point for, I think, for universities to think about. We're going to go ahead and move to the Q&A if that's okay. There's a combined question we're going to ask, which is, how can Native voices be heard at institutions trying to silence us? Can tribal leaders or community organizations speak up to support Native students? So how can Native voices be heard at institutions that are trying to be silent? And then the other side, how can tribal leaders or community organizations speak up to support Native students?
I think like what Athena said a lot is that there is so much strength in community. And so even though there were so few, you know, Native students in my experience, I did have a lot of community with the Native students that were there. And then I also had a lot of allies in my corner that I was just really lucky that there were people at the institution who saw the, you know, history of Indigenous erasure that Quinnipiac was participating in. And before I had even gotten there, wanted to do something about it. And so they kind of like sought me out when they heard that there was a Mohegan student at Quinnipiac and were like, we would love to work with you. And there was a lot of learning on both sides of like for that, learning for them how to make that partnership effective, learning how they can best support me even learning what I am looking for out of an ally. Because I think so many of us don't really know until we get into situations where we need them. So really leaning on community, I think, in spaces of making our voices heard, especially when it comes from like faculty and administrators, like as a student, having their support is another level of like of helpful. They can book spaces on campus for you. They can host events without having to have it tied to an organization. They can pay usually through like smaller but budgets within departments and stuff. Nonetheless, they can help pay for bringing speakers in. So a lot of our early work before the Indigenous Student Union got recognized was through those partnerships with faculty members who um, eventually came together to create what Quinnipiac now calls the Indigeneity Initiative. And so it's a collaboration of primarily allies that are faculty members, alumni, students who are just really dedicated to kind of indigenizing the university. And so we need people like that at the forefront of this. We need people to realize that it isn't just Native students that this would affect. Like you said, Robin, like this is better for everyone. In so many ways. So yeah, having that community kind of for the first part of that question. And then I kind of forgot what the second part of the question is, so I'm gonna let Athena talk while I remember.
Can you repeat it just one more time?
Sure, of course, yeah, and I'm happy
Thank you.
to do that. It is how can Native voices be heard at institutions trying to be that are trying to silence them? And then can tribal leaders or community organizations speak up to support Native students?
Yeah, I mean, it does happen. It happens often, the silencing, and I think also, you know, even when there's been a lot of harms, as I mentioned, within curriculum, and now, you know, for me, I'm as a mentor, not in any kind of like official capacity, but what I mean by that is like I just recognize the Native students that are there, and I show up. You know, they have my number, and they can call on me whenever things are getting hard. And so I think it just takes having an advocate also helping with your voice being heard. But it doesn't, you know, still these things still get kind of changes can be slow, and that's something I think is hard to witness. Like, we want things to change right away, but understanding like slow change is long change, and that's okay too. But yeah, being able to have people kind of at least, listen to one another, but also help advocate also with you, so that you don't feel alone, or you don't feel like your whatever it is that is your concern isn't valuable. But institutions often kind of will go business as usual, right? Even when we are saying, hey, there's a harm here, or there's something that needs to be done to change, and it can kind of, they can say one thing like, oh yeah, we'll do that, and then it doesn't happen. So I think it just takes folks making, that that are witnessing that, to also just make sure that these things are being followed through with on the institutional level. I think that, for tribal organizations, like, they are, especially, tribal councils, they're strapped thin. That's, the place to go is I would say, like, not to be the, like, my aunt's on tribal council, but my aunt's on tribal council. and I know just how stretched thin that they are. So I feel like a lot of times people are like, yeah, go to, we want a relationship and to speak with folks on tribal council. But I feel like the more realistic approach is maybe one, identifying community members, and maybe then two, there's also cultural departments within tribes, and I feel like those might be a better bridge. There's other people within tribal organizations that might have the answer for you that you're seeking, or for the institution that they're seeking, that isn't just like the face of the tribal council. So seeking kind of those individuals out too, to for whatever that is. But yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
No, it does. And I appreciate you providing that insight too. And for others to think about when we think about tribes, that it's not just a tribal leader, though they're important. There's multiple places within a tribe that people can reach out and build relationships with. And I think that's very pivotal for us to remember, and to also let other people know that. And I really also appreciate when I was in Washington, the Puyallup tribe, their language department really put the responsibility back on the faculty. Like, once you learn this, then we'll work with you at this point, right? And so, like, putting that also that responsibility back on like the faculty as well. And so I really appreciated that. And I think one thing I would just add, thinking about like being silent and like the community organizations and support. When I was at the University of New Mexico, there was an effort to for Indigenous Peoples Day to be acknowledged and to also abolish the presidential seal, which was racist, within the university. And I was at the time the Kiva Club advisor, which is like their faculty advisor, and they were, I would say to some degree, trying to be silenced. But the Kiva Club partnered with the Red Nation, with multiple other organizations, to be able to like build the solidarity movement to that visibility. And then they also created a list of demands and delivered that to the administration. They also were able to work with like media. So getting the story out there to like different websites and different media so that they could share what was actually happening. And I think that visibility, along with like keeping present, and again, these are students who are doing all of these other things, but they're present in all of the things that were about abolishing the seal, but they were present in how to strategize on like how to sit at different tables and talk about why this is important, right? And I know you kind of talked about that too, Kiara, is like having to be intentional about like how to make that movement heard. And it took about 5 years, but they finally, and more than that, actually, like the abolishment of the seal started in like the 60s. And that movement started again in like 2014, 15, but they actually got the presidential seal removed in like 2020, 2019. So it did take many years to be able to see that movement made. And it was all because of that visibility of the media and also the partnerships from local community organizations that were a part of that. So I just wanted to share that as like a potential example as well. Um, so we'll go to the next question, which is, in the context of today's social and political climate, how can we encourage and support Indigenous students to feel safe and empowered to use their voices and advocate for awareness? What behaviors or strategies can Indigenous and non-Indigenous faculty and staff use to help reduce the mental and emotional burden that often comes with uplifting Indigenous youth voices? And I'm happy to repeat that if you ever want me to.
I have just a quick note on the last question, really quick. Something that came to my mind when Athena was talking is a lot of the times universities will operate as businesses and they will do things that they think make them look good. We learned very quickly in the like powwow planning process that the reason why it was going smoothly was because they knew it was going to make them look good that they were having the first ever powwow in Hamden. And then when it actually came to like doing the thing, the support was not there. So having that translate, like let's, especially when it comes to the money. But on the note of this question, I work in public health, and so I struggle with this a lot because in my previous job, when I was like working in a very community-facing role, and we would have community members come into the office and express concerns about today's social and political climate, there wasn't much we could say. It's really hard at this point to give like advice with all of the unknown and the uncertainties that there are. So kind of like my biggest, what I've always said to people and what I think translates to this conversation is that it all comes back to, like Athena was saying, that strength of community, knowing that like we still can do the work that we've been doing on the ground, the way that we've been doing it. Yes, we might need to get a little bit more creative to think of the ways that we do things. But that core foundation of who we are and what we do is not going to change. And so I think if universities can take that stance, they should. And by can, I mean they should regardless. Um, there's way too much, like we've seen across the board, of universities giving in to the demands of the current administration. What a slap in the face that is, not only to Indigenous students, but to all students, like not even just marginalized students. Like this is a bad thing for everyone's education. And so it's really, really hard, I think, to make people like feel better and encouraged when this is going on. But if you can, like just bringing it back to like that community support, I think is a big part of it. And from the level of student peer to faculty to administrator to president of a university, to be able to look your Indigenous students in the eye and continue to tell them that you are committed to their safety and their education and their well-being in the face of all of these things, that's good. But if you can't do that, then that's the problem. And I think more often than not, people can't do that. Um, and then, so what behaviors or strategies can non-Indigenous faculty and staff use? In my public health work, and then I just think in general in my life, I'm very interested in cultural connectedness and the role that that plays in the maintenance of our well-being. Um, I'm not gonna like do a whole big public health spiel on it, although that's like my instinct. Um, but at a kind of foundational level, we know and see that cultural connectedness has an impact on health outcomes, specifically mental health. Um, and that is something that was really hard for me, is not only was I struggling to do all of these things for the organization I was trying to create, struggling to take my classes, struggling with family issues at home. I also didn't have an Indigenous like elder or anyone else like that I felt that had like the kind of wisdom that I needed to really guide me on that journey. And I also didn't have spaces where I could, I couldn't smudge. It was a college campus. You can't light things up. I didn't have a fire I could go to. I didn't feel comfortable going anywhere on campus where I could dance without people looking at me like I was crazy. And so that was like, I think the lack of cultural connectedness to me was a whole mental, emotional burden in and of itself, in addition to all these other things I was going through. So when we have spaces on campus where students can engage in culture, I think that's like life-changing. And when they have people on campus who are experts in that culture, who can really help guide them on those emotional and healing journeys, that's even more helpful. And I think that in a lot of contexts, like Quinnipiac, for example, that is a very far off in the future dream. We don't even have like a space on campus that's only for Indigenous students right now, like a physical space, so we wouldn't have anywhere to do that. But to get towards that place where, I think in order for us to be able to maintain our mental and emotional health and our spiritual health while being advocates and change makers within the university, we need to have spaces where we can be unapologetically Indigenous. And that is more than just standing up behind a podium and giving a speech at a community event. That is also being able to go dance, being able to smudge, being able to do whatever it is you need to do to feel connected.
Yes, exactly that. Kiara, yeah, I think making space and having space to be able to come together is truly what will keep us strong and well. These are incredibly scary and oppressive times. Like every day, I'm in fear and scared, and I know a lot of us are feeling that way. But I know that also in these times, like we have to cultivate joy. We have to still come together as people and just share time, like to hear each other, to be able to express that, and then also, just try to find ways of laughter and so, like for in my community where we're doing, some somatic breathing workshops, and we're just meeting on the Oak Savannah, and we're doing games, and we're just kind of coming together on an evening and listening to one another and just showing up for each other. But I think, like Kara said, it takes having that space to be able to do that and to feel safe to do that. That's something that, there's no guarantee in that. And I think um, Portland State University has been unique in its capacity of, like, we now have a few spaces on campus that are indigenous spaces. Like I was a part of a science building renovation on our campus that indigenized the building. We renovated a science building, we indigenized it. We have a whole floor that teaches, native science and native first foods and medicines. And so that's been incredibly wonderful to have that space. But like I also mentioned, the university still requires our Native American Student Community Center to fund itself. And they're struggling with that. And money was missing. There's just been some weird things. And so for students to really feel safe, the Native American Student Community Center, the doors have been closed. And so for some folks that don't know about our, other spaces on campus, that can be hard to find the community. But I think we are lucky that we've been able to kind of take some spaces back. We literally took spaces back on campus, and it's been a long process. Like Robin said, a lot of this stems back from years and years and years ago when elders and students like just, dream this up, and then it's just been an ongoing, it gets passed down to the new students that come in and the new faculty that come in. And I think luckily for Indigenous communities, I think we are used to that kind of like passing the baton. And so it can almost be a bit, it's nature to us to show up in that way and to kind of step in and to continue on and have that be on our backs to support one another. But that is what it takes. These are scary times, and just to recognize that community is where the strength is at. We're all feeling it, for sure.
Thank you. Thank you both. I really appreciate the intentionality you share about the culture needs to be present. The safety of being yourself on campus is like the vital part of what we need for our Native students. And in Oklahoma, we had an anti-DEI executive order in December 23, and we weren't really sure about the impact that would have on our Native students. They said initially it wasn't, and this will actually tie to our next question, which is, yes, Native people, we are sovereign. Sovereign, we have 39 tribes in Oklahoma. But one of the things that we've seen because of that executive order is like there has been this, within a university context, some universities honor tribal sovereignty, like I'll say the University of Oklahoma has honored tribal sovereignty and have upheld that, but there's other universities who have not, because we have often been lumped into DEI. And so one of the things that we've seen over the last like year and a half is many of our Native student affairs professionals who are there to support our Native students who are there, unless they're an Asantni, which is a Native American serving non-tribal institution. If they're not an Asantni, which is grant funded, then all of those people have lost their jobs or they have been shifted to other places on campus. And so those Native student support programs no longer exist, or they're lumped into like share with everybody, right? And so one of the things that I've been a part of, which is the Oklahoma Native American Students in Higher Education, which is a conference, but now we're becoming an organization, as we've been coming together on a monthly basis to kind of just like share space together, but also to advocate about tribal sovereignty and like how we are not DEI, we are tribal sovereign as Native students and Native student affairs professionals, Native faculty. And so I think educating other people, but also making sure Native students don't feel like they're by themselves. So on like a campus level, being there with the Native student leaders and saying like, what can we do to support you? I'm here. I don't want you to feel like you have to bear all of this workload because the person that was there before is no longer able to do all the things they could, right? And so just wanting to make sure, and I appreciate both of you sharing that you are doing that, you're reaching out, and you're providing that support. And so that goes into the next question, which is, in today's political climate, what is a concise way to explain why Native nations are separate from DEI?
I feel like, I mean, you've mentioned it before, you know, it's in that sovereignty that we are sovereign nations. We are sovereign people that these are our homelands. So I think that's sort of in and of itself. That's to me the answer there is like it is. I think just to recognize that, and I think that is hard for folks to really like maybe understand that, but it's that we should be able to be leading ourselves in that way. And so regardless of whatever space we're in, that doesn't matter because our sovereignty stretches beyond and it expands beyond just in any one capacity. You know, it's not just on our reservations. It's not just in certain areas. It's everywhere. So
Yeah, I think of it a lot too. Race, the way that we think of it in this country is made up. It's a social construct. It's something that like it's not like just saying that is not an opinion. Like it's documented, it's changed over time. When I look at like my family line, it goes from us being Indian to us being white to us being Indian. Um, and so the category it's sometimes we're labeled as black. It changes over time because it's made up. And so I think it does get really confusing when people are like, well, American Indian, Alaska Native is a race, so why doesn't it fall into DEI? I'm like, well, it's a race in the way that we in the United States categorize people by skin tone, but it's really not a race in practice. It's a political identification, it's a citizenship, it's belonging to a land, like Athena was saying. And so, yeah, it's hard to explain, I think, the designation and when you're not within that. Um, Community, but that's the way that I've explained it when this question has come up is that it's like, yes, American Indian is classified as a race within our racial categorizations, but it's also a political identification and it's something that is separate from the realms of DEI in that way. And then you get the argument of people being like, well, isn't it the same thing as like international students in that way, which then it would still fall under DEI? And I'm like, we could fight about this all day, but then that's when the fight starts is when those conversations about sovereignty and like what it really means to be a sovereign nation um, is. And that also leads way to some very uncomfortable conversations sometimes about where your true loyalties lie as a citizen of both a country and a tribe. Um, but yeah, lots to say. It is definitely, I think, a complicated process, but hopefully that clears it up a little bit as to what makes it so different.
and I will just add, like our treaties are the supreme law of the land. Just go read some treaties, you know, go read some treaty law. Like that's the supreme. And I know like right now we're seeing everything being dismantled, right? But that's something that we will be fighting for our treaties, for that supreme law, you know, tooth and nail for sure. And that's, you know, we are a good people, but we are a fierce people too when it comes down to it. And so
Yes, yes. Thank you. Those are beautiful ways to explain it. I think I would just add, we are not DEI because you can't take away our culture, our language, and our identity, and that's what makes us Native people. And so I really appreciate that. And so we'll start closing it out. Again, thank you so much, Kiara and Athena, for sharing your hard work, your wisdom, your experiences. But if you would have any last words, of anything you want to share about building partnerships, what would you dream of? What is a beautiful Indigenous future for creating partnerships within universities, or what would be your hopes for the future? And so I'll leave it there and ask you all if you don't mind sharing about that.
I would say that I just hope every university understands the importance of having visible Indigenous education within their institution, having a place like Kiara mentioned too, and with, I'm in architecture, so placemaking is everything to me. I understand space as architecture is an act of taking land and building upon it. And so I think for institutions to be having a dedicated space, and then also putting their money where their values are into our communities, and then just making that actually visible for folks, because it's not just for Indigenous folks, right? Like there's that for us, for what I've seen in my experience, the relationships that extend beyond just Indigenous students, for allies, for everybody else, like it is such a beautiful uh togetherness that then kind of like ripples out into our communities, once we start inviting people in and we sort of see where that medicine and that magic happens between those relationships. And so I would really hope just that, even in these like really dire times, that we can understand that we have a lot of really good, we've had thousands of years of understanding these lands and what, how to take care of these lands, and these have been passed down to us, for generations, and we carry that wisdom. And even if for folks that are reconnecting and everything, like that lives in ourselves, that lives in our DNA. And so I think it's just about having the space that's visible, having that community and people willing to be able to make mistakes, and just come together eager to learn. That's what it will take. And Shuwashinila, thanks for having me here today too.
Yeah, I have lots of dreams of like what I wish it would look like. I think limiting myself now for the sake of a shorter response, very similar to what Athena said, like just knowing that like in the future, if I have children and they choose to go to any college in the United States or beyond, that I know that they would be at a foundation safe. And when we think of safety, like that's not just, their safety physically, it's their safety internally. Like, do they feel like they can be themselves unapologetically without harm, without fear? Do they have spaces where they can do that? Like going back to the physical spaces. And I think as, coming from my public health background, something that is so important to that is the culture. So like, do you have a community gathering where, intertribal communities are coming together and it becomes like an actual, community space, where it's not just relying on the students to build that community, things like that. I like, again, I could kind of, I think, imagine what this could look like for so long and get very excited doing that. And even some of the things that are ruminating in my brain, I'm like excited to bring back to the Indigenous Student Union as an alumni advisor and be like, what if we did this? But yeah, I just want to say again, Kutatom Tamawashi, thank you all so much for having me. If you want to connect at all, feel free to do so. I'm the only Kiara Tantaquidjan, so it's not hard to find me on LinkedIn and stuff like that, and social media. And the Sunrise Healing community is out in the world if you want to connect with that too. Shameless plug. But yeah, thank you so much, and I am really looking forward to the kind of action that can be taken from the suggestions and the insights that, me, Athena, and Robin all shared today, and really hoping that if you are on this call listening in, that you have learned something that can be really meaningful, to your experience moving forward. So again, kutaptom tamawash.
Thank you. Thank you, Athena. Thank you, Kiara. You all are amazing. Sister, aunties, relatives, thank you for all you're doing. And I think for me, I would just say departing, if we can have our universities become relational spaces where we learn how to be a good relative, we learn how to be good grandpas, grandmas, elders, aunties, sisters, cousins. I think if we embed that in how we do what we do in universities, then we'll be much less harmful and we'll be more accountable because we are all related and connected. And so I'm really grateful to you both for sharing time today. I know everything's busy, and thank you to those that are able to join us today. I hope you take some of these words with you. And I know some of you may be in the same places where we're talking about and sharing from, and just know you're not alone and we're all in this together. We are resilient, we're strong as Indigenous people. We've been here since time immemorial, so we're just going to continue to thrive and remember our ancestors are with us and their prayers are carrying us through every day. So thank you. Aho and katiayo.
Shimigwech. I just want to thank again all of our speakers and Robin for facilitating such a wonderful conversation today. Um, I myself learned a lot and just am so grateful for the stories you all shared about your own experiences, the stories you shared about some strong partnerships that you've been a part of, and really just everyone for attending today's event and being curious about what this could look like, what the future or what future possibilities there are. And I think as we indigenize our places, indigenize our facilitation, as these speakers have shared, we really do see benefits for everyone. And so, again, just a huge thank you to everyone who attended and shared some time together today. Um, our apologies if we didn't get to your question. We had some really great ones come in, but we are going to be publishing a written guide likely next month, sometime after we wrap up this series. So hopefully that written guide will address some of the questions you have. And then we did record this event, so we're going to be sharing that out later as well if you want to watch it or share it with others who you think need the knowledge. But we really just hope that today's speakers and the information shared really helps you feel inspired to continue learning about these issues, share information with those close to you, and ideally take action once you have a good idea of how you can support or how you can partner. And if you learned something today or enjoyed the event, consider contributing to NGC. You can visit our website at nativegov.org. And additionally, we just really want to hear from you. We're going to email a survey out to all of the Zoom attendees from today, and we'll post a link in the chat as well. But just stay tuned for future virtual events. We'll be offering more on this series next week and at the end of the month. And you can find more events after that on our website. But many blessings to everyone. Again, thank you so much for attending and this time shared together today. Giga Wabamin, I hope to see you again soon. Bye, y'all.